Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode. This is Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Thank you to our listeners and subscribers. Thank you to you who have referred us other people, referred us guests. Today I have a guest on, Pablo Gonzalez. Let me just share a little bit about Pablo and how we came to connect with one another. It was a few months ago. I actually had the opportunity to be on Mad Singer's podcast. He's the host, and the name of his podcast is Mad Singer Management. So we did the podcast, and that was actually released back in March. I don't really think a whole lot about interviews that I do. I certainly want to help people promote them, but the interview was done and it was released. And I was looking on social media. I was looking on LinkedIn in particular, and somebody had tagged me. And I'm like, okay, what's this all about? And, you know, sometimes you see the tags and it's just, you know, a like or something like that. But this was a full out comment. So I tuned into it, and it was Pablo. And Pablo had a 3 or 4 minute introduction. Well, not introduction, a 3 or 4 minute discussion of my podcast interview and the things that really resonated with him. So, of course, naturally, I'm going to reach out to Pablo and say thank you and send him a connection request, and we connected and just said, hey, you know, we should probably talk. We're kindred spirits on this. Let's talk. And so we got on the phone and started talking, and we think alike when it comes to networking. And so in that conversation, I said, Pablo, I need to get you on the podcast. And so here we are, Pablo.
I'm super happy to be here, my friend. When you say kindred spirits, I very much felt that. When I heard you on Mads' podcast, you hit a couple of notes, you know, specifically when he first asked you the number one thing you tell people to get started with, and you went down the philanthropy route. I was like, man, this guy's going to be my new best friend. So happy that we connected, man. Yeah,
no, I mean, it's interesting because I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and that's kind of the first thing that jumped out at me. There's a litany of volunteer experiences. I mean, you know, I shouldn't say most people. A lot of people have volunteer experience on their LinkedIn, and you should. And that's one of my big things with respect to networking. One of the first things you should do. But I look at you, and it goes all the way back to, oh my gosh, it goes back to 2011. I count 1, 2, 3. I think there's probably 10 different things that you have been engaged with over the years. I'm humbled. I'm humbled. That's great. Humbled in the sense that I don't know that I've been that involved. But I guess my question is this: Did you intentionally volunteer to get yourself networked, or was it something that you just volunteered and just discovered that it created a network for you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Right? Just like everything else. I would definitely use the term stumbled into unlocking this really great truth, which is what we have come to know, that is the value of networking through philanthropic communities. But specifically for me, I had moved back from California to Miami in 2009 to start a green building consulting practice. And at the time, there was a movement for philanthropies to start young professional groups, because Miami had this like really appalling statistic of the lack of involvement of 23 to 40-year-olds in philanthropic activities. And my best friend at the time forwarded me this email from Habitat for Humanity looking to do just that. And at the time, I thought, oh, Habitat for Humanity, this is construction. I'm reconnecting with the community. This will be a good business development thing for me as a green building consultant. And I thought that it would be a good business development tool for me, which it really at the time was not. But what it led to is something that completely changed my life forever, which is, you know, we started this group. Within a year, I was the president of the group. I was on the board of Habitat. A year after that, I was in this like Leadership Miami program. A year after that, I'm on the board of a couple of different charities, right? Like I started this whole parallel track of my life.
Right.
And within that time, my green building consulting company got acquired by my biggest customer. I went in-house as director of sustainability. And at a certain point, I had just kind of been pigeonholed as like the green guy and this like hospital developer, university developer. And I was able to use the connections that I had made by being all these years involved in these, not just connections, soft skills, and general knowledge that I gained from doing the philanthropic engagement that allowed me to then totally pivot my career in a time where I was just at this moment where I was just, felt completely marginalized, and I was able to turn it by becoming a business developer. And after that, and it led to this whole viewpoint of community creation is the future of business development based on these experiences, which I'll be happy to elaborate. I just don't want to talk for like 20 minutes and not give you a chance here.
No, I mean, I have that as a note from our previous conversations. But I find it very, and we will get back to that, but I find it very interesting that just your story about volunteering, and it's, it sounds like one thing led to the other. I use the drug analogy, right? You tried a little bit of drugs, and it kind of led to more and more and more. And Habitat for Humanity was kind of that gateway drug for you to kind of get you really involved. But the interesting point, that analogy aside, that I took from that is, it wasn't obvious at any point in time. And I think that's the problem, is people are looking for the obvious. So, well, if I volunteer with this, what's it going to mean for me? Am I going to get website clients? Am I going to get a life insurance business? And they're looking for that obvious connection, and it's never really there. It's something, but you don't know what it's going to, how that volunteering is going to manifest itself. Fair?
Yeah, that's fair, man. Volunteering, networking, even what I've evolved to now, which is content. It's not direct response marketing, right? Like this isn't a hard-nosed closer sales process. What we're talking about here, but what you will find, right? Like what I found in getting involved with Habitat to start was, number one, when you get to Miami is a flaky city, right? Like everybody thinks of Miami, they think of the glitz and the glamour and all this other stuff that people don't really associate with volunteering and philanthropy. And what I realized is that once I started forming young professional groups in the name of a charity, I was able to attract really great people that felt that they needed a home, right? Like they felt that, man, I'm so sick of this usual party scene, right? This is like the young professional line back then, but it was like sick of this party scene where people just care about themselves and whatever. I would attract these young professionals that were just looking for something else. They were either new to town or they had been there for a long time and were just kind of fed up with it, and say, what we're doing here is we're attracting, at the very least, people that care about a little bit more than just themselves. And that was the entry drug for everybody else, right? Like, it's just like, how can I surround myself with good people? And, at the end of the day, if you're involved in a philanthropy, you pass that test, at least in the smallest amount, right? The next thing that we started uncovering was that the way that we would structure our meetings was that we would have a once a month meeting with the leadership of the Young Profit organization, and we would be hosted by somebody sitting on the board of the charity itself, right? So with Habitat, we called it the big board and the little board, right? So people that sit on these Habitat for Humanity board, Miami Lighthouse for the Blind board, Miami Beacon Council board, they are generally movers and shakers and business influencers and decision makers in society, right? So now what we started doing was, we would say, we're here to do this stuff for Habitat, but guess what? Once a month, you're going to get a chance to have breakfast or lunch with a leader in your community, where they're going to give us 20, 30 minutes of their career, and we get to pick their brain. And then after that, we plan out our little happy hour that's coming up, or our volunteering event that's coming up, or a big fundraiser that's coming up. So we started facilitating relationships with people based on involvement in the nonprofit. And the way that started trickling up is, once I started becoming the leader of this thing, now I'm the guy that's reaching out to the superintendent of schools, or the CEO of Ryder Corporation, or, whomever else, right? A mayoral candidate. And I started realizing that if you are if you are representing a charity or you're representing a group of people, it's much easier to get in front of somebody that you want to get in front of than if you are just like, hey, yeah, I'm this developer guy. I want to talk to you about maybe changing some zoning requirements over here, right? Like if
Right.
you have something to offer someone, for example, this podcast is a perfect example, right? Like you are more likely to get a best-selling author on to meet with you for 30 minutes because you have a podcast and because you're going to share this with an audience than if you just wanted to pick someone's brain for 30 minutes, right? So to me,
yeah.
the philanthropies became that. It became the guilty by association stage I could share, or the co-branding I could share, to then leverage that to get in front of other people, all while attracting good people around me that I could steer in the influence that I thought was, best for society or whatever. So it just all kept on escalating as a big ball of added value. And at a certain point I looked around and, you host enough events or meetings or fundraisers, and you inevitably get on stage a couple of times and you start becoming a good public speaker. You inevitably start getting invited onto panels and you're speaking on panels, and you start getting used to that and used to that business model. You start moderating these things. It starts giving you all these soft skills that, unless your boss was like, oh, you know what? I like this Pablo kid. He's got good energy. I'm going to put him to like do the next pitch, right? How else are you going to get that exposure?
Right.
But not through some kind of avenue like that. So all of that started adding up together, not to mention that, I started this when I'm 29, 5 years later, 10 years later, now all these people that I started these young professional groups have moved up in their careers. They have all become decision makers in their companies like I have. So you start developing this web of connections, and it all culminated at one point when I told you I was feeling really pigeonholed as the sustainability guy in this company, and I wanted to transition into business development. At a certain point, the CEO of my company got invited to speak on a panel about smart cities in front of the Economic Development Agency of Miami. And he didn't feel like going. I don't know why, but he didn't feel like going. So they sent me in his stead. And when I show up, I get on this panel and I share the stage with the head of Latin America for Cisco Systems, and the head of the Smart Cities Initiative for the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, one of these like international institutions. And at that point, I had all these reps being on stage, speaking on panels, whatever. So I was able to be comfortable in that moment. And what happened after that is when I came off that stage, there was a line of 6 people deep waiting to talk to me. And that had never happened to me before. And what I realized was that when you are on a stage, right? Like when you're on a stage in front of people, it adds a huge amount of validity and value to whatever you're saying, right? Like the human mind rationalizes, oh, because that person's on the stage and I'm in the audience, this person must really know what they're talking about. They must be influential. They have some kind of added value. And that aha moment of the value of a stage has now really shaped the way that I see everything I do in networking, right? In networking, I try to figure out how can I put people on a stage so that they feel this elevated sense of value, and therefore always attribute it to me providing that stage to somebody. So what I did on the next step was I realized that this happened. I reached out to a developer that was developing this like high density project in a low density, high income neighborhood in Miami that nobody in the neighborhood, the rich homeowners didn't really want it, but he was developing it right on top of the Miami Metro rail line, and therefore incentivizing public transportation in Miami. It's called trans-oriented development. So I knew that this was important. I reached out to him and I said, listen, I'm going to have one of these panels. At this point, because I had been part of philanthropies, I had a bunch of young professional audience that I had on a big list. And I said, I'm going to invite the young professionals of Miami to learn about trans-oriented development. I'm going to put you on stage with a politician that's on the board of one of my charities and a land use attorney that's on the board of one of my charities. And we're going to talk about how important this is for Miami through the viewpoint of your audience. And he showed up. He was more than happy to do that. Mm-hmm. About 20 young professionals showed up. We have this informative event. And a week later, he's knocking on our door saying, hey, are you guys bidding on this $60 million project or not? Right. So that completely changed my paradigm within my company, but I wouldn't have been able to connect all those dots, right? I wouldn't have had the audience of people that I could leverage. I wouldn't have had the experience of being on stages and understanding how important it was. And I wouldn't have had the connections to put him on stage with a politician that was in his best interest and a land use attorney that's in his best interest, had I not put in, the work of developing this network and leveraging the good name of nonprofits to be able to attract people that I could have their attention, and also attract people that I wanted to develop a relationship with that I could put in front of the people whose attention I had.
That's an awesome story. I mean, it underscores the point. I mean, none of this was scripted out, right? You didn't know this was how the story was going to unfold. It just did. But
Correct.
it could have gone in a lot of different directions. Any one of them equally as impressive. But you were, like you said, you put the time in. Now, you do a lot with content, and as I'm listening to you talk, it's almost like, well, obviously being on stage is content, right? It's just not content that's as repurposable as a podcast, let's say, unless you're recording it or something like that. But it is content, correct?
Yeah, correct. I think the other way, I really think about it more the other way around, is that content is a stage, right? Like this podcast is a stage for you.
Sure.
A YouTube channel is a stage. A well-curated email list is a stage. I think of introductions, like I think of a person-to-person introduction as how can I make this a stage, right? Like when I introduce two people, and I've introduced you now to a couple of people, right?
Yep.
I'll write, hey, Frank, meet Jeremy. Jeremy, meet Frank. Jeremy. Frank is an expert in networking. He has figured out a better way to bring people together in an organization, and he teaches them how to get better referrals, and he's an author, and he's my kindred spirit because this and that. You're going to love him. Frank, meet Jeremy. Jeremy is a veteran that's trying to build a business and help other veterans. And he is a telecom expert that thinks he can change the industry by bringing in a new workforce. And I think that your help can do this or that, right? So like I always put two people on a pedestal, so that way whether the connection works out or not, they still read an email and look at it and think, oh man, this guy just totally propped me up and made me seem really important, right? Yeah. So the other person reading it gets that effect. Like they get that, oh wow, this guy seems to have done something relevant and he's important to me. And the person that's being introduced is like, wow, Pablo really cares about putting me on a platform. And whether that connection ends up, you know how it is when you introduce people, sometimes they follow up, sometimes they don't. Whether they do or not, that psychological factor of, well, at the end of the day, Pablo just put me on this stage. He didn't really have to. He just put me on his platform. That plays into the long-term relationship of people thinking that knowing that you have their best interest in mind, and whenever they have an opportunity to have your best interest in mind, they're going to reciprocate.
No, I totally agree. And I like to make introductions in a very similar manner to you. I think what it does is it creates a level of trust. Neither party is coming in guarding their wallet, right? I mean, if I said, hey, Pablo, I want to introduce you to Bob Life Insurance guy. He's got to meet quota by the end of the month. You're going to be like, well, wait a minute here, right? You're a lamb being sent to the slaughter. But with the introductions you've made, the introductions I try to make it even-handed. Like each side has got something to give here. And I'll have people come to me and say, hey, would you introduce me? And it's like, yeah, okay, I just need to know what's the value you bring. I realize you want to meet this person, and I see the value in it for you. What's the value in it for them? Because that makes it harder if it's not on both sides. Almost makes it impossible. It almost makes it a favor, right?
Sure.
All right, go ahead.
And listen, on this value tip, right? Like I like to tell, I think that gets harder. The older the person that you're introducing is, the harder that gets, right? Because I love telling young people this. I love telling young people, don't underestimate the value of your youth to someone that you're being introduced to, right? Because it's real easy for you to introduce a 25-year-old as like, hey man, I think I'm not 20, I'm 39, right? But like, let's say I was 25 years old. You could introduce me to someone as like, Pablo's this really sharp 25-year-old that's going places, and I think that it would behoove you to meet them because he wants to, pick your brain and see if you can influence their life. That by itself is a little bit of value that, to me, when I see a sharp young person, I want to meet them. I want to be a part of their journey, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I agree. I think you need to have some kind of value prop, some kind of something to give back to in order to make that introduction on both sides. But I like to encourage young people to not underestimate the value of their youth in the introduction, because and that is a diminishing asset, right? So take advantage of it while you can, while you're young, and just having the wonder of being young and the ability to affect someone's trajectory long term is a valuable thing to give someone.
Well, and on the flip side, people who are older looking at that, if you've got contacts that are 65 years old, 10 years from now, they're probably in retirement. Meeting the person who's 29 years old, 10 years from now, they're moving and shaking, right? So you can't dismiss that. You can't look past people because they're.
Yep.
You just never know. It made me think of your YouTube series. The number one, the first video I watched, ironically or interestingly, the number one way to bond with people was add value, and that is so true. You want somebody to remember you gotta add value. You have to add value.
Totally. And I expand that. To me, the two things that make people connect is, one, add value, right? Like if you,
Yep.
I'm sure you're a student of this stuff, right? You probably
Yep.
read Robert Cialdini's Influence, how he talks about the Hare Krishnas in the late 70s, early 80s had this like super successful campaign because they would give somebody a flower and ask for a donation.
Yep.
And that idea of getting a gift and not giving something back is it's hardwired into our brain. When we receive something, we want to give back, right? The other thing that I think adds a lot of adds quick connection is a shared vulnerability, right? And it's kind of a finer line to walk, but that's why I preach authenticity in when you're networking, right? Like the more yourself you can be, the more likely you are to attract someone, right? That's why veterans bond with each other. That's why people of the same generation bond with each other. You've all just kind of been through the same struggles, so you have some vulnerability to share. When I meet somebody that has lost a sibling, I bond with them very quickly. Or if I meet somebody from Venezuela that's, immigrated a country, you bond quickly, right? So also getting to that point of feeling comfortable enough to be yourself so that you can share a vulnerability with someone, that will quickly connect you. And I think when you're networking, a really easy way to do that, or you're asking a big question, is to just say, oh man, I'm really uncomfortable at networking events, but I'm here to see how many people I can meet. I'm Pablo, right? And that immediately will lower someone's guard, and everybody can relate to that.
Yep. All right, I want to get back to something we touched on earlier, and at some point I need to get you back on because you have. I'm looking at your YouTube, and you have so many insights, and you had mentioned you've got 50 tips, and we need to get you back on and really kind of dig into some of those things because those are really of value. But community is the future of business. Let's kick that around for a little bit, if we could.
I'd be happy to, man. You ever have you ever known of anybody that has a Harley Davidson, Frank?
Yes, I know people with Harley Davidsons. Yeah.
If they were to change brands on bicycles, would they lose their friends?
They might lose their life. Yeah. Oh,
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Like, I don't think this is a very new concept, right? It's just that very few businesses have been able to do this at a high level because it takes some very, serious branding chops to do it. But at the end of the day, I see us, we're moving to this future right now, Frank, where you and me can be talking and I may say, man, I really need a vacation. And all of a sudden, 2 hours later in my Facebook feed, there is like Cabo San Lucas, all inclusive paid, right? Like, is that my phone's listening to me right now? Maybe. Is it that the algorithm knows that at a certain time I'm going to be wanting this? Probably. But I could see very clearly a future where I'm walking around with whatever the next version of Google Glass is, and I see someone's shirt and the logo and my pupil dilates, and all of a sudden I'm offered like every Lacoste shirt that's on sale or whatever, right? Or I tell somebody that I'm not happy where I work, and all of a sudden, whatever the job board posting is, I start getting all these job offers or likely things. I think that future is coming. So how do we prevent employee and customer churn? To me, it's very simple. It's you make the people that use your product or use your service or that work for you, you make them friends with each other, right? Because you can change products, you can change companies, but you can't take your friends. And I believe that from my experience in the nonprofit world of growing these young professional groups, of getting people to bond through a common interest, putting some kind of valuable relationship or piece of information in front of them that they can bond around, that starts to bond people, right? So when I was the VP of business development for this e-commerce company, we started losing clients a lot, right? Because we were going through some hardship with our technology, and we had these new competitors and a couple of other gaffes that we did as a company. And as we were losing clients, I reached out to our 12 highest level users of the software. And I said, listen, guys, we're going to start having a call every other week where we're going to give you some kind of content, some kind of value add thing. And then we're just going to have a little therapy session, right? And it would be really simple. We would show up and either tell them what we were seeing across the Amazon ecosystem, or, one time I had just read Never Split the Difference. So I showed up and I kind of talked about negotiation and a couple of things I learned there. And then we just open it up and say, Loretta, what are you struggling with? And Loretta would say, I'm having a hard time managing my VAs. And I turn around and say, oh, Emmanuel, you're really good with your VAs. What are you doing? How can you help her?
Right.
And enable that conversation, right? What started happening was within a couple of months, they were all best friends, right? Yep. They bonded very quickly because it was share a vulnerability, have someone help you with it, right? Vulnerability, add value. And as we kept doing these calls, it led to a live event that we did with just invite only this group, where we learned a couple of great things and learn, I gave everybody a SWOT analysis and how to present their business. And then we took all those lessons learned and turned it into a course, and we sold that course for $5,000 a pop. And then we had an event 6 months later where we put them on stage to talk about the things that they knew, right? So like we elevated them to the stage, and all the while we were having these recorded Zoom calls of all this, like the interaction I just told you is a real interaction, right? So a couple of weeks later, Loretta showed up and she was like, oh man, thank you so much. I did this and it really solved my business. So guess what we did with that content? We turn around and we're able to make now marketing content of someone saying, I can't manage my VAs. Hey, do you have this problem managing your e-commerce operation? And right there, that's compelling, right? And then all of a sudden you show that same person saying genuinely, oh man, thank God you guys provided this solution for me and you really saved the day. And then it's, we're not just a software, we're a community. Come join our Facebook group. And you'll get the benefit of all this. And then all of a sudden someone joins the Facebook group. They realize that the person that they saw in an advertisement is not a paid actor, but they are this person at the top of our customer ecosystem inside some secret cool club. And oh, by the way, they're speaking in 6 months, so I can go ask them the question of what I've been wanting to ask them. And it just creates this perfectly delineated customer journey. And that to me is community creation for business development, is figuring out how you can take your customers, you have your product or your service in the middle, you find your customers, you find whatever value you can bring them that you can aggregate them in front of, make that, record that, and then you can start sharing all those lessons learned at scale, all while developing this nucleus of people that you are bringing close together. They're adding values to each other's lives. They're becoming friends, and that just starts to mushroom out until the point where you have this, this community around your business. And we experienced it, right? Like a lot of these people, they could have, when a new competitor came on board, they could have gone and tried the new software. They could have gone and tried this, but they knew that if they left this like little tight nucleus, all of a sudden they weren't going to be part of these calls. They weren't going to, they were going to lose a bit of connection with their friends who had rallied around this business. So I've just basically, taken those lessons, which really is an evolution from what I learned in the nonprofit world. I learned it in this e-commerce world. And I think any business can do it. Right now, my biggest client is a real estate investing firm, a $450 million real estate investment firm. And we've just done the same thing, right? We just figured out who in their network can provide valuable content to the people that invest with them. And we have a call. We actually have 2 calls a week, one that's like a show on Tuesdays and one that's a Q&A on Thursdays. But now there's people that literally plan their weeks around attending these calls and being there to comment and being able to watch this stuff, and it's creating a community around this business that has already led to increased referrals from their existing clientele, to increase repurchasing, right? So like the existing clients are now investing more because they're so all in on this thing, and all while the content that we're creating around giving the people advice and giving them value is bringing in more and more people into the ecosystem. So that to me is just something that a bank can do, a restaurant can do, a photographer can do. Like I just can't think of a business model that wouldn't be able to figure out how to, combine these elements to create this like ball of value that creates more frictionless sales because you're driving relationships among your clientele.
No, I totally agree. Much of what AmSpirit is about is that it's a community. And that's a lot of what keeps people around is the community.
Correct.
We're running short on time here. 2 questions. How can the audience listening, how can they help you? What would be a good introduction for you, a good referral, and then how could they contact you? And we'll try and certainly get your contact information in the show notes.
Yeah. So number one, Frank, is I literally want to be friends with everybody. That's if you're listening right now, I want to be your friend, right? So reach out to me. That to me is a valuable enough thing. My website is connectwithpablo.com. My email address is youshould@connectwithpablo.com. My social media handles are Connect with Pablo. So however you can connect with me. My podcast is the Chief Executive Connector, right? Oh, I want to say this, Frank. When I came across your podcast, I love this podcast, right? Like this to me is, if I was to make a podcast about networking, this is it. So my podcast is not that. My podcast is more everybody that I meet, how I met him, deconstruct that. And we talk a lot about content and relationship building, but it's not specifically about networking because I think you got that covered. But I would love it if anybody listened to my Chief Executive Connector podcast. And a good introduction for me, Frank, like you say, right? The when you do it, not what you do. For
Right.
me, when a business owner knows that they want to, they know that there is this big opportunity to create content around their business, right? Like they want to be showing up on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube on a regular basis.
Right.
But they think it's a lot of work for very little reward. I am able to help them design and execute a content creation plan that does all these things, that creates all that content that they want, but it's also driving relationships between their consumers and their clientele, and they're able to use it to network up the same way that I was using the young professional groups to get in front of people that I couldn't get in front of. So now this content creation engine isn't just making little videos on TikTok or Instagram. It's actually a tool that you're using, and the content is just, a side piece that comes out of it that is really, really valuable without them having to spend 20 hours a week thinking about what am I going to say? Like, what do I need to say on Instagram, right? So that's a valuable introduction. Anybody that's trying to make content that feels overburdened by making the content and knows that there's a better way to do it that they can really deploy, I would love to talk to that person.
Sounds great. Well, I appreciate your time, Pablo. This has been insightful.
Frank, I appreciate your time, man. I appreciate our relationship that's already grown to what it is. I really appreciate what you're doing, right? Like I'm a really, really big believer in the stuff that you're putting out, specifically in this podcast. It can really, really help people's lives, man. So I'm just honored to be a part of it.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.